Okay, sorry about that abrupt ending there. My dog, our dog went berserk because of the mailman. Anyway, I trimmed out that part. Let's get back to the Stamp Act, shall we? All right, where were we? Well, the Stamp Act is, in effect, as it spreads and as resistance to it rather spreads, it's really the pivot where most histories of the American Revolution begin, because it's where you see the intercolonial organization of resistance rather than just kind of sporadic expressions of discontent about something like the Currency Act. This is very different, very radically different. And in fact, it is the beginning of several key developments that I want you all to understand and know. The first of which is, I've already mentioned, it's an intercolonial movement that is unprecedented. The second is that part of that intercolonial movement that is generated by the fall of 1765 is the creation of something called the Stamp Act Congress. This is a meeting of the leaders of the movement of the resistance, the Sons of Liberty, basically, who will come together to debate and discuss the appropriate response. Believe it or not, this is really the first forerunner of today's Congress, because it is the forerunner of something that becomes known as the Continental Congress, which formulates revolutionary policy, and that is the body that will eventually declare independence. And it is from that body, subsequently, with the creation of the Constitution, you actually get the Congress. So this is really the germ of all of those institutions. It begins here. It's significant in other ways as well. Or in addition, this issue of cross-class alliances, in which it's not just a group of elites coming together and debating what to do, but it's enlisting ordinary people as well. And in fact, many of these ordinary people are taking the initiative. There are a lot of folks in between too, who you wouldn't really describe as elites. Like Sam Adams is not, he is not, you know, on the same level as a wealthy Virginia planter, but he's sort of in the middling classes. And so this is a kind of broad-based movement. In addition, while you see the use of threats, violence, coercion as part of the tactic, you actually see something far more interesting develop as part of the resistance to the Stamp Act. And that is a decision on the part of the Sons of Liberty and others to boycott British goods in protest. This is arguably one of the world's first consumer boycotts as a way of articulating political power. For those who have no vote in Parliament, this is a very powerful cudgel with which they can beat the British economy. Why? Because at the time, a quarter of all exports from Great Britain, a quarter, it's a very significant chunk, are going to the North American colonies. This is not a minor cut into the British economy. It's a pretty slashing move and attack. Precisely because this happens, a lot of London merchants, a lot of people on the other side of the Atlantic who make their money from selling stuff to the colonists begin to put pressure on their members of Parliament to do something to repeal the Stamp Act, to find some face-saving way where revenue can be raised, but not via this way. Okay? So these are all ways in which the Stamp Act is a harbinger of things to come. And while the battle rages on, you know, pushing out and stopping the implementation of the tax, which they're quite successful at doing, by the spring of 1766, you see Grenville step down. He has a replacement named Lord Rockingham, who bows to the pragmatic realities on the ground, and the Stamp Act is repealed. And this is a critical turning point because this is the colonists, through through direct action, shown here. And note, interestingly enough, that this is direct action not just of whites, but that the African Americans are participating as well. That combination of direct action, consumer boycotts, all the different methods of protest have ended here with the Stamp Act repealed. And this is a celebratory teapot, because you got to remember the colonists drink a lot of tea, and this is a way of commemorating an important victory in their war with the imperial authorities back in Great Britain. However, there's a coda to this story, which is that when Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, it simultaneously passes something called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act is a sort of saber-rattling piece of legislation that declares, as the title would suggest, that Parliament has the right to legislate for the colonies, and here's the language, in all cases whatsoever. Interestingly enough, this is an act that in its language is almost identical to a similar piece of legislation passed much earlier in 1719 toward Ireland, arguably England's first colony closer to home. And so this is a rather than a clear-cut victory for the patriots, the colonists, it's rather the beginning of something much longer. Now, when you're thinking about this, writing about it on an exam, whatever, just for your own interest, understand that in 1766, we're still a decade out from independence, and it's really not clear that this is going to end with a military conflict. In fact, what am I saying? It's not only not clear, no one is thinking that, okay? It's not even really, that's not even on the table at that point. However, events have a funny way of outrunning realities, or expectations rather, and fairly quickly a new raft of revenue proposals comes down the pipe from Parliament. These are known as the Townshend Duties, named after a man named Charles Townshend, who is a very big player in the king's inner circle. He has to deal with the fiscal crisis, the problems of not having enough taxes. And so he comes up with a different set of taxes. These Townshend Duties, as they are known, or taxes, impose taxes on something that hadn't been taxed before. These are imports to the colonies of things like glass and paint and tea and paper, things that were being shipped from Great Britain to the colonies. So if you remember that little thing about mercantilism, if you may recall that in mercantilism, the colonies are supposed to have this kind of special relationship with the mother country, and it's totally fine under mercantilism to tax imports to the colonies that are coming from outside of Great Britain. But the whole point of this, they thought, was that if it's this kind of reciprocal relationship, that they're not going to be taxed on things coming from the mother country. Well, this tax, or these taxes, fly in the face of tradition and change that dynamic. Moreover, these taxes are going to be earmarked to pay for something very specific, the salaries of the royal governors in the colonies. And that's kind of rubbing salt in the wounds, because it's like, not only are we going to slap a tax that is unprecedented, we're going to use it to pay your overlords who are implementing and enforcing imperial policy. This is momentous for several reasons. Because it effectively telegraphs to the colonists that they are going to have limited leverage over colonial governors. You may not realize this, but prior to this time, most colonial governors were often paid by the colonists by raising taxes on their own. So that actually gave them some leverage. They kind of controlled the power of the purse, and they paid the governor, and they had to pay them a certain amount, but they could withhold that too. Now that's going to be replaced by a system of taxation that is novel and new, and it's going to take away their leverage over the governors. A final point about the Townshend Duties. That's Townshend. The part of this is they create these courts in the major port cities in which merchants who violate the navigation acts, the acts governing trade, the mercantilist legislation that dictates who can trade with whom, people who violate that, and by the way, the American merchants have been violating this all the time. They've been smuggling goods without paying taxes for years. These courts are now going to be able to try merchants for doing that, okay? All of this, along with some smaller outrages embedded in this legislation, causes immense outrage. And the man who emerges as the voice of the resistance now at this point is someone new. This is John Dickinson of Philadelphia. Dickinson is a lawyer. No surprise, almost all of these guys, it seems, had some background in law. And he's a very smart lawyer, but rather than saying, I'm a lawyer, he wrote something called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. So kind of retooling himself, rebranding himself as a man of the people. And these letters offer a detailed refutation of the Townshend Duties, and specifically lays out a novel argument about Parliament's right to regulate trade. He says in no uncertain terms that Parliament does have the right to regulate trade, but it could not use that for the purpose of raising revenue without some form of representation. If the colonies are deprived of that, in other words, if they have taxes imposed upon them without representation, then, as he put it, American liberty is finished. And to submit to the Townshend Acts, he wrote, was to become, and he used the word slaves, all right? So this was an idea that a fear he was articulating, that this was the beginning of an erosion of the colony's autonomy in the guise of raising funds, but this was really a battle not so much about taxes, but about representation. And as a consequence, the stakes were very high. Massachusetts Assembly responds, inspired in part by Dickinson's manifestos, calling for unity of the colonies. And the colonial governor appointed by Great Britain is ordered to shut down the colony's legislature if they declare this letter and endorse it. And they do endorse it, and he shuts down the assembly. And this sets off a firestorm of controversy because it happens in other colonies as well. Similar protests against the Townshend Acts, similar calls for collective action, and then recrimination and retaliation on the part of the colonial governors. In response, what do? You get the same thing you saw in the Stamp Acts. The Sons of Liberty organize, and they organize massive, bigger British boycotts this time. And they seek to get an even wider number of Americans involved in the movement. This now sees formal declarations of what are called non-importation. In other words, people swear, they vow publicly that they will not import British goods, that they will boycott. And this is coupled and goes hand in hand with public shaming of anyone who is not down with this program. So here you have someone being called out in a what's called a broadside. It would have been like a big piece of paper, like a poster you see tacked to a bulletin board on campus. It's like that, you know, here in Boston, and it's targeting this individual, William Jackson, who was an importer. They're like, you know, we don't care. If you buy anything from him, you're on the wrong side of this. Note too, something else that is very interesting about this. It is desired that the sons and daughters of liberty, in other words, this is no longer a group of men acting. The women now, who are significant consumers of goods because they oftentimes control household economies and are responsible for buying everything from new linens to other imported goods. They're going to be part of this as well. And so women begin to become involved in the political realm. They begin to take action by refusing to buy things, and by, in the case of the women, engaging in public demonstrations. For example, what are known as the Daughters of Liberty begin to have public sewing, public wool spinning demonstrations, where they're spinning wool into thread, and that can be made into cloth. These are demonstrations of their virtue in refusing to buy the fripperies that they had previously purchased from the British. This is a massive battle that the Townshend Duties are unleashed, that the Townshend Duties unleash. It goes on for 3 full years. And by 1769, many people in Parliament believed that relations between the colonies and the mother country had started to drift dangerously close to open conflict. Edmund Burke, who was one of the parliamentarians in this era and a kind of leading thinker, he's one of the kind of fathers of the conservatism as a political ideology, who was nonetheless sympathetic to the Americans, had this to say about relations between the two sides. And I don't normally like to read text slides, but I want to just emphasize some things. He says, the Americans have made a discovery, or think they have made one, that we mean to oppress them. So he's recognizing that there's almost a strain of paranoia that he's detecting. And then he says, we have made a discovery, or think we have made one, that they intend to rise in rebellion against us. So he's acknowledging what a growing number of individuals in Parliament are fearing. We know not how to advance, and they know not how to retreat. Some party must give way. In a nutshell, this neatly captures the dilemma of where this conflict has brought both sides by 1769. Though Burke is articulating this in such, kind of blunt terms, I'm not certain you could say that this was true, in a much wider way. He was more perceptive than most people, and I think understood that there was no way that this could continue. The status quo would have to change, for example, and things could have been done. Americans could have been given representation in Parliament, right? That would have shut us up, right? But that's not going to happen, as you know. I think we all know where this is going. So let's try to figure out then how we get from this, where it's sort of an impasse, to actual open revolt.